Thank you all for being here. My name is Joseph Clarke. I teach over in the History of Art department. I teach the history of modern architecture. It's in recognition of the 150th anniversary of Canadian Confederation that tonight's lecture is co-sponsored by the History of Art department, the Daniels faculty, and the Canadian Studies program. And it's great to work collaboratively across the university on putting together such a worthy event. So I want to thank Dean Richard Summer and Professor Nelson Wiseman, the director of the Canadian Studies program. Tonight's speaker is Professor of Architectural History at the Illinois Institute of Technology, of course the famous Mies van der Rohe designed university in Chicago, where he also serves as interim dean and the director of the college's PhD program. Somehow, while juggling all of these roles, he's found time to co-author the remarkable new book, Canada, Modern Architectures in History, which is quickly becoming recognized as really the essential text on Canadian modern architecture. And we actually have copies of the book for sale tonight at a special price of $30, cash only. Get them while they're hot. Just come up and see us afterwards if you're interested in purchasing the book. His research on Canadian architecture adopts a broad social and cultural perspective, situating the development of the built environment in relation to landmark events in Canada's history, including the construction of the Transcontinental Railway, the formation of the CBC, and the adoption of an official multiculturalism policy. Now, don't let his Italian name fool you. Some of the faculty and staff over in the art history department still tell stories about a bright young PhD student in our department named Michelangelo Sabatino. So our department is, of course, very proud of everything that he's accomplished, and we're very glad to welcome him back to the University of Toronto to present his lecture, Beyond Wilderness, Modern Architectures in Canada. Please welcome Michelangelo Sabatino.
My sincere thanks to Joseph Clarke for his kind introduction, and to all my friends here at the University of Toronto. You may not know this, but University of Toronto stole my beloved colleague, Joseph, from us, IIT. So I'm happy he's here, but I'm unhappy that he's not with me. Special thanks go to dear friends George Baird, Larry Richards, Bridget Shim, Bruce Kuwabara, all of whom can't be here tonight, so they get a special thank you regardless. And as Joseph said, I do have very, very fond memories of the time I spent here as a student with Alina Payne, who's no longer faculty in the U of T's Department of Art. Focusing, did I get this right? Great. Focusing on Canada and the Americas might seem like an unexpected turn away from my previous scholarship on the vernacular tradition and modernism in Italy and the Mediterranean. But for those who know that at least one of my three passports is Canadian, the motivations might be a bit clearer. And although biography should not be the sole reason for taking on a scholarly project, it can provide, as it has for me, some greater degree of personal stake and familiarity with the object of study. I started this project with my Vancouver-based co-author Rhodri Windsor Liscombe with a sense of scholarly duty to bring attention to a body of high-quality work that is yet to be inserted into a broader transnational historiographical context. I also joke that since the Canadian government gifted me with a lot of money as a doctoral and postdoctoral student, I owe something to the Canadian taxpayers. Our book is part of a series published by Reaction Books in London that critically explores national contributions within a broader global context. I am particularly interested in the relationship of Canada to the Americas. Rhodri and I endeavored to write as much of a cultural and social history of Canada as an architectural one, and we tried to make this of interest to both general and specialized audiences. Each chapter is built around driving concepts and activities in daily life that architectural modernists sought to specify and satisfy. Our thematic scaffold comprises a cross-section of types and activities: dwelling, connecting, learning, representing, working, constructing, consuming, and recreating. The gerunds deliberately emphasize an ongoing process. This tweet appeared in October 2016, several months before our book was even released, our friend Pierre Bélanger. While I have no problem with constructive criticism, I do have a problem with the speed and superficiality of social media. After reading one paragraph blurb on the publisher's website, the author of this tweet jumped to unfounded conclusions. Certainly, our book is not perfect, but nothing that a second edition with corrections, especially to the index, can't solve. Writing in his seminal manifesto, Vers une architecture, first translated in English in 1927, Le Corbusier, in his typical hyperbolic language, celebrated the volumes of the monumental grain elevators of the Americas by asserting, here are American silos, magnificent first fruits of the new age. American engineers and their calculations crush an expiring architecture. Not surprisingly, Le Corbusier did not go to great lengths to distinguish between U.S. and Canadian silos. He, following the lead of Walter Gropius, saw in the engineering aesthetic of the New World a modern architecture ante litteram, in which stylistic burdens associated with 19th century historicism were shed in favor of frank application of form to function. Anticipating Le Corbusier's interest in the grain elevator by nearly a decade, Gropius published an article, seen here on your left, in the Deutsche Werkbund-Jahrbuch of 1913. The top image is Elevator 2, number 2, designed by Canadian-born engineer John S. Metcalfe, and was located in the old port of Montreal, just across from the domed neoclassical Bon Secours market that you see there. The bottom image is of a grain elevator A in Port Arthur, now Thunder Bay. A page from Le Corbusier's manifesto on the right features the Canadian government grain elevator at Ogden, just outside of Calgary, realized in 1914 and recently demolished. Paris-born Montreal painter Adrien Hébert dedicated considerable attention to the Port of Montreal, where Elevator 2, we see here, offers a dramatic painterly counterpoint to the black and white photos deployed by Gropius. The transnational or international quality of these architectures are perhaps best understood in relationship to a network of infrastructure, road, rail, and ship, that made them possible. Roads and railroads played a fundamental role insofar as it allowed for agricultural commodities to be transported to ports where they would be shipped to markets outside of Canada. The network of railroads explains why the Canadian-born engineer Metcalfe would also design the Santa Fe Railroad grain elevator seen here, located on the south side of the Sanitary and Ship Canal in Chicago. And I see this battered icon every time I drive along the I-55 to IIT. The advert advertised by Canadian Pacific Railway was aimed at encouraging migration to farmlands and highlights the relationship between infrastructure, architecture, and agriculture. The poster reads, "Traversing the Great Wheat Region of the Canadian Northwest." The travel of American and European modernist ideas, types, and techniques demonstrates how borders are porous. Take, for example, this Chicago School commercial building designed by Edmund Burke, the Toronto Simpson's department store, completed between 1896 and 1923. Since grain elevators, as Le Corbusier, Gropius, and later Rayner Banham highlight in their various publications, were built throughout Canada and the Americas, from Chicago to Buenos Aires, one could argue that there's nothing particularly Canadian about them whatsoever. Yet, the Canadian government chose this symbol of utilitarian architecture, engineering, and commerce for its pavilion at the 1937 Paris Exposition. Émile Brunet's diminutive grain silos stand in stark contrast to the austere classicism of Albert Speer and Boris Joffan's pavilions for Germany and the Soviet Union. But this decision to embrace a seemingly neutral engineering aesthetic belies an identity of a country confederated in 1867 that willingly accepted its role as a source of revenue and resource for its colonial master, England. A number of American painters celebrated the rural and brought it to the forefront of modernity by elevating the grain elevators to the status of ancient monuments. Not by coincidence, Charles Demuth's oil painting is entitled My Egypt, seen here to your left, of 1927. Charles Sheeler's painting, Classic Landscapes, is of 1931. The fight for Canada's resources by the two founding traditions of France and England ultimately deprived the First Nations people of the land that rightfully belonged to them for thousands of years. Voltaire mused in Candide, you know, that these two nations are at war about a few acres of snow somewhere around Canada, and that they're spending on this beautiful war more than all Canada is worth, end quote. No laughs? This is a pretty serious audience. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham that unfolded in 1759, same year his satire was published, was a decisive conflict between France and Britain that eventually led to England claiming Canada. Since Voltaire dismissed the country as a few acres of snow, the image of Canada as wilderness nation has functioned as a powerful cliché of identity. Here we see a painting of 1855 by the Dutch-born Canadian painter Cornelius Krieghoff, entitled Mailboat Crossing, where the canoe, another symbol of Canadianness, and the portage tradition, is seen as a vital tool with which to navigate the dangerous frozen waters of the St. Lawrence, along whose banks Quebec City and her citadel that we see here can be seen at the lower right hand. The sense of vastness and the majesty of nature permeates the work of some of Canada's most acclaimed modernists, like Group of Seven artist Lawrence Harris, the heir to the Massey Ferguson farm machinery. Lawrence Harris, whose Mountains in the Snow, seen here, a rocky painting Mountains number 7, circa 1929, broadcast this image to the world. During the first decades of the 20th century, American photographer Ansel Adams captured the majesty of the Canadian Rockies with the modern photographic gaze during an excursion taken with the Sierra Club in 1928. Here we see Mount Robson from the vantage point of Kinney Lake. MoMA curator of photography John Skarkowski credits Adams' trip to Canada as a tipping point in the young photographer's career. Here, too, geography points to the difficulties of writing national histories. We all know that the Rockies don't stop at the Canadian-American border. Our challenge while writing the book was to address what these slippages in issues such as borders imply. The numerous species of migrating birds, Canadian geese being the noisiest, ritually move between the Canadian and American borders, thus demonstrating that nature pays little attention to political borders. The photo on the left shows a humorous aspect of boundaries as it relates to identity. And the photo on the left, rather on the right, the destruction that boundary enforcement implies. Yet the U.S.-Canadian border is often cited as the longest undefended border in the world. The satellite view shows or tries to show, explains how geographical features such as landforms and ecosystems that transcend national borders can work. North America's most important features shared by the U.S. and Canada are the Great Lakes, the prairies, and the Rockies. This diagram shows the remaining wilderness in North America and draws attention to the fact that Canada's built environment and its cities are mostly located along the border. Here. While commenting Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, William Lyon Mackenzie King, Canada's long-serving Prime Minister of the Depression and World War II eras, declared that, and I quote, "If some countries have too much history, we, Canada, have too much geography." Our book seeks to show how modern architecture in Canadian history has been fashioned by the nation's massive size, as well as its concentrated demography and diverse geography. We believe Canadian modernist design coalesced through the impetus of varied and often competing design concepts and practices that emerged out of broader patterns of 19th and early 20th century modernity in both the Old and New worlds. Harold Innis, one of Canada's greatest historians, whom Marshall McLuhan credited as his mentor, asserted that, and I quote, "Canada emerged as a political identity with boundaries largely determined by the fur trade. These boundaries included a vast north temperate land area extending from the Atlantic to the Pacific and dominated by the Canadian Shield. Technological nationalism thus led to a systematic exploitation of Canadian resources from fur to lumber and most recently to oil. The Transcontinental Railway, engineered by the Scottish-born Sandford Fleming, united Canada from sea to sea, both physically and politically, to protect against the potential American menace to the south. Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, declared as the construction was about to begin in 1881, and I quote, "The road will be constructed, and the fate of Canada will then, as a dominion, be realized. Then will the fate of Canada as one great body be fixed." Scottish-Canadian photographer William Notman shows us a view of the trellises of the Canadian Pacific Railway and the havoc wreaked to the Canadian wilderness by the railroad. Here is Alan Fleming's streamlined logo, launched in 1960 for the Canadian National Railways. In here, advertising. Out of the subjugation of the Canadian economy, the provision of what Innes referred to as staples, to use the concept he coined early on, was born some of the most complex architectural hospitality machines that provided accommodation to members of what economist and sociologist Thorstein Veblen defined as the leisure class. Here we see one of the most celebrated hotels associated with railroad development in Western Canada, the Banff Springs Hotel in Alberta, designed by American architect Bruce Price between 1887 and 87 and rebuilt in the first decades of the 20th century after the fire by architects Walter Painter and J.W. Orrock. To be sure, Canadians have done much to embrace and exploit a national identity based on land as a source of beauty, character, and resource as anyone else. In this promotional pamphlet seen here, distributed during the 1933 Century of Progress International Exhibition in Chicago, you read the following: "The Canadian Rockies, 50 Switzerlands in one, are famed throughout the world for the vacation appeal to the tourist and sportsman." The interdependence between staples and symbols of national architectural identity in Canada can be understood through this ad. Canada's neo-Gothic Parliament House is deployed as a backdrop to sell one of the most celebrated exports of Canada, Seagram's whiskey. Notice how Canadian is underscored here. The modernist masterpiece of the Seagram's Tower, opened in New York in 1958, owes much to the illuminated patronage with which we associate Phyllis Lambert and the Brompton family. This patronage was made possible by entrepreneurial practices associated with Canada's agricultural products such as grain and therefore whiskey. With this example in particular, we understand the full extent of transnational exchanges of finances and know-how underlying architectural modernity in the Americas. Lambert exerted her influence to bring Mies to Canada. The Toronto Dominion Centre, seen here in the photo by Panda. This Toronto-based architectural photography firm was to the profession in Canada what Ezra Stoller and Julius Schulman were to the profession in the U.S. Building was completed in 1969 and was hailed by Philip Johnson as the largest Mies in all of the world. As a side note, when I lived in Toronto as a PhD student, I made a point of setting up my account at TD so I could go occasionally to the banking pavilion. Toronto and Montreal both embraced Mies, whereas Canada, as Western and Eastern provinces, held this austere rationalism at bay. The impact of commodities and the resources that they generated exerted a considerable role in the post-World War urbanization of Canada. I made a very, as a side note, specific to avoid this disease called Toronto-centrism, and I was very careful to avoid writing with my colleague, writing a history of Canadian architecture by being excessively focused on this city, especially because you're not going to be popular after I say this, especially since I don't think that some of Canada's best work has been produced here in this city. So we can talk about that after. It's a point of debate when you kick me out of the building. With this so-called progress comes violence to nature, as can be seen in this aerial that shows the future site of Kitimat being torn out of the British Columbian forest. This new town was initiated by the Aluminum Company of Canada, Alcan, in 1950. Clarence Stein, great American planner, was directly associated with Kitimat. The company was encouraged by the provincial government, British Columbia, to consider building a large dam to generate electricity for aluminum smelter and regional industrial development. The project required construction of a permanent community near the fishing village at the head of the deepwater Douglas Channel, occupied by the Haida First Nations. From their name, People of the Snow, Kitimat was taken. The volatility and tragedy of modernity, modernization, and modernism is that these processes have given us as much as they have taken. Over the decades, faith in modern progress and technology has gradually been eroded. For example, we know that what was once celebrated as a magic mineral, such as asbestos, after which a town in Quebec where it was mined was named, deployed by architects for decades and decades, is now understood as a major health hazard. The English architectural team, the Mars Group, to which Canadian-born Wells Coates belonged, designed the modern exhibition seen here in 1937 to much acclaim and made abundant, and advertised this, abundant use of asbestos panels in order to promote this modern material. As this graphic reveals, Canada's rural population over the past 60 years has changed dramatically from being a majority to a minority. Modern architectures and urban planning initiatives have thus played a major role in transforming a wilderness nation into a network of urbane cities and towns. To be sure, there still remains a large part of land that is not inhabitable. In many ways, and I'll say this as an aside, I really think Canada is very similar to Australia. Huge landmass, concentrated built environment, and in a way, the built environment and architecture are even more important in a country like this. And I think that's one of the lessons that my author and my co-author and I learned throughout this process. The powerful transformation process of modernism has invested some of Canada's major cities. In these two aerial images of Toronto in the 1930s, to your left, and the 1970s, we understand the substantial transformations that one of Canada's major cities underwent in a relatively short period of time. The Royal York Hotel, seen here. To the left, behind the famed R-100 airship, a dirigible balloon that came from England, was one of Toronto's major skyline presences. In the 1970s, it almost disappears, eclipsed by the Toronto Dominion Centre and the 1,815-foot CN Tower. These two views of Montreal show the lookout from Frederick Law Olmsted's Mount Royal, overlooking the low-lying city and its more recent surrender to the enchanted mountains of tall buildings that constitute Montreal's business core. Here we see the cruciform Place Ville-Marie, tower by Americans Pay, Cobb, Freed and Partners, completed in 1963 with the financing of American businessman William Zeckendorf and the Italian architect Luigi Moretti's with Pierluigi Nervi's Stock Exchange Tower of 1964. So as you can see, what Canadian architecture is really highly, it's less about a style, it's more about the fact that this country has relied extensively on émigré architects. And it's through this kind of wonderful chemistry that is developed that it's offered to the architectural community, these buildings. I will say that the big difference, and this is in great polemics that I'm saying this, the big difference is that it used to be that émigrés, whether it's Eberhard Zeidler or Notman, came to Canada and they stayed and they contributed to the kind of cultural life, the educational life of this country. What's been happening in the last 10 years that the global architects just come in, drop their buildings off and leave, never to be seen again. That is a big difference between a kind of global multicultural society that cultivates these contributions over time, and the kind of drop down, I'm just leaving you a building and taking off kind of attitudes that have been more popular in recent years. Here we see the Olmsted plan for Mount Royal, Montreal's Central Park, which gives creation a viewing platform for Montreal, and of course the St. Lawrence River. What is now Canada's third major city, Vancouver, is seen here in an early 19th century aerial with Stanley Park in the foreground. A recent view of Vancouver shows the transformative power of residential urban buildings within the urban core, traditionally reserved to offices by Orthodox modernists that have made this West Coast city into the epicenter of Vancouverism, which has great merits but also has big price tags, as we know. If railway played an important role in uniting 19th century Canada, radio was the protagonist of the first half of the 20th century. The pioneer of long-distance radio signals, Guglielmo Marconi, was the first to unite the shores of the Old and New Worlds with the help of Canada. The easternmost shores of Canada's maritime province of Nova Scotia hosted Marconi's wireless stations, seen here. Modern architecture was key in building the image of radio, as we see here with the Canadian Broadcasting Transmitter Station at Watrous, Saskatchewan, completed in 1939. Writing in Canadian Architect, Toronto-based communication guru announced ominously that with the development and incorporation of electronic technology in Western society, no place is a margin. Of course, this is Marshall McLuhan. As a side note, we've recently published, I don't know if any of you know this series, it's a series on Canadian Modern that I am the commissioning editor for, published out of Dalhousie University Press, and we've recently published by a young scholar, Michael Windover and Anne McClellan of York University, this book, Seeing, Selling, and Situating Canada, radio in Canada, and we've done a number of other books. Capello's published this one on competing modernism, Centennial Projects, and ours on Erickson was the very first. The railway station in Ottawa, completed in 1966 by the most Misesian of Canadian firms, Parkin & Associates, is the last great monument to a dying breed of transport. As in the U.S. with the interstate system established in 1956 by Dwight Eisenhower, the automobile became the preferred communication and recreation mode in post-World War II Canada. The Trans-Canada Highway, following the model of rail, unites Canadian cities and towns from the Pacific to the Atlantic Oceans. Opened in 1962, the highway was completed in 1971. Highways generated new architectural types, like the shopping malls surrounded by parking lots, like the Yorkdale, seen here, opened in 1964 in conjunction with the expansion of highway infrastructure. Arthur Erickson, Yorkdale Station, was opened in 1978 to much acclaim. The rise of jet travel focused design and planning efforts on a new type, the airport. Here is a view of the modernist airport at Gander, opened in 1959 on the extreme tip of eastern Canada. The International Lounge, seen here, is replete with Mondrian-esque floor, mid-century furniture and artwork. Once the jet age and bigger fuel-carrying capacity for airlines made refueling at Gander before crossing the Atlantic unnecessary, this airport was sidestepped and experienced a sharp decrease in use, so much so that this building is now threatened. The Allied arts were closely associated with modern architectures in Canada. Here we see Gander's Lounge with the 69-foot, 12-foot-long, 12-foot-tall mural by Canadian artist Kenneth Lockheed, and the armchairs designed by Danish-born Montreal designer Christian Sorensen. We sourced many of our images through the Canadian Architectural Archives in Calgary, Alberta, whose curator is Linda Fraser, and she was incredibly helpful and generous with us. because they own the copyrights for Panda. Here's one wonderful image of Toronto Pearson's International Airport of 1960 as it projected Canada and Toronto in particular onto the international stage. This international reputation is part due, at least among architects, to the competition held in 1956 for the Toronto City Hall. Not unlike the Sydney Opera House competition held just a few years prior, it attracted a large number of participants from around the world and reflected the growing mobility of architects and the globalization of practice during the post-World War II years. Finnish architect Viljo Revel won the competition, and as is the case of most modern architecture, it caused some fatalities, like this Beaux-Arts Deeds building seen here. This is an image you've probably seen other times of the Toronto City Hall submissions gathered together. The large number of these competition entries is self-evident, and what was very interesting is many architects sort of migrated to Canada following this competition. If the Toronto City Hall competition did much to excite curiosity toward Canada, it was Expo 67 and Moshe Safdie's experimental housing Habitat 67 that became the icon of a multicultural nation that empowered immigrants like Safdie to take on leadership roles in design. Safdie, as you know, arrived to Montreal from Israel and was studying architecture at McGill when he conceived of Habitat. Another McGill and Cornell grad that went on to make significant contribution to architectural education in the world is Alvin Boyarsky, whose tenure at the Architectural Association, during which he conceived of the unit system, encouraged pluralism at the expense of ideological homogeneity. It is perhaps worth noting that the school in Canada and at McGill, led by John Bland, promoted modernism while enforcing a certain appreciation for history. And this is in the curriculum of the McGill School, thanks to John Bland early on in the 40s and 50s. Canada's equivalent to Ellis Island and Lady Liberty is seen here as the former immigration terminal of Pier 21 in Halifax. Those arriving to Canada by ship would disembark here and after vetting would travel to various cities throughout Canada with the train. Now, I'm going to give you a little story. I had a godmother who arrived to Canada at about 13 years old from Italy. And she once told me a story. She said, Michelangelo, when we arrived to Halifax, we looked around and it seemed like a very poor town with wood construction. And he said, we thought we were leaving a poor country and we were wondering if it was better to go back. No Lady Liberty welcoming, but rather a very modest town of the maritime provinces. But then making their way by train, they found other realities. Despite publishing in a series of modern architecture with a national framework, as we did, we have endeavored to debunk simplistic interpretations of nationhood, especially as it pertains to Canadianness. For example, one of Canada's most celebrated firms of the 1960s, later established as ARCOP, Architects in Co-Partnership, seen here, consisted in architects of Greek, Polish, French, and English descent. Hazen Size, Jean Michaud, Raymond Affleck, Guy Desbarras, Dimitri Dimakopoulos, and Fred Lebenshold. With this in mind, professional journals like The Canadian Architect, established in the 1950s, and their counterparts with more regional focus, such as Western Homes, seen here with architect Barry Downs with his family, provided venues in which to debate the nuances of regional and national identity in architecture, modernist or otherwise. A comparison between John B. C. Parkin's house in Toronto, completed in 1954, and Arthur Erickson's Helmet Epic house, designed for West Vancouver and completed in 1972, demonstrate different ways in which Western and Eastern architects in Canada responded to site. Erickson wrote, most of our buildings are only half buildings, or must seem to you, your Eastern eyes, because the other half is the site. You think in the more architectonic terms of complete geography, rather complete geometry. Your buildings have flat bases where ours seldom have. I think our bottoms are the clue to our difference, end quote. The years leading up to Canada's centennial in 1967 brought some of the most iconic images with which we associate the nation today. The Canadian flag, or the maple leaf as it was unofficially known, adopted in 1965. The nation's flag shed associations with England associated with earlier flags. And it is worth noting that only with the Citizenship Act of 1947 was Canadian citizenship conferred and a passport as separate from British nationality. So anyone living in Canada up to 47 didn't have their own Canadian passport, which is very interesting in terms of the mindset. Paradoxically, the centennial celebrations of 1967 focused on nationhood and did as much to bring out regional differences as they did national ones. Canadian-born Arthur Erickson was the nation's first truly public architect and the first to be trained in Canada, as opposed to having immigrated to Canada. At the height of his career in the 1960s and 1970s, Erickson was the subject of a number of documentaries. He is the subject of my forthcoming book on Erickson, if I ever have time to do any writing, after I've taken on this deanship. Here we see Erickson on the cover of the 1972 magazine, Canadian edition of Time, as hailed as Canada's master architect. And we see him some years later, decades before star architects became commonplace, as a spokesperson for Air Canada's Air Miles program. It is worth noting that Erickson wrote to his brother in 1951 the following: "I would say that Canadian architecture is impossible, simply as I think Canada is impossible as a single culture or a single people. I think we're very, very distinctive regions and highly different problems climatically and everything else. And until we really recognize these things and respect the differences, I don't think we'll act very well together." End quote. This is in 1951. With the exception of John Lyle, who is remembered for his bank buildings, most architects, though, in Canada did not theorize a kind of Canadianness, and maybe for the better, but they took rather pragmatic approaches to site and materials. Erickson's Graham House, shamefully demolished in recent years, was featured in popular American press such as Life magazine, and as it turns out, appeared in the same issue commemorating the abrupt death of Martin Luther King. Few architects can claim to have been impersonated by the likes of handsome Richard Gere, seen here playing the straight version of Arthur Erickson in the drama romance Intersections. With his wife played by Sharon Stone, Gere is seen here examining a model of his, Erickson's, University of British Columbia Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver. The overlap between modern rationalism and Native American building traditions is seen here in this dramatic photo by Edward Curtis, and translated and transformed into these amazing post and beam elements of this, one of Erickson's most beautiful buildings. Erickson's professional image of artist, advocate of high-quality public architecture, Howard Rourke, fountainhead figure, stands in sharp contrast to the image of a large corporate architecture firms like SOM, or the model of architect as businessman or businesswoman, seen here in the two photos of Parkin and Associates Partnership Office. And we see on the right John C. Parkin overseeing his corporate team. Even though Erickson would go on to direct 4 offices at the height of his success, including one in Los Angeles, he never relinquished his control as the architect and artist of the firm, whereas Parkin did. Phyllis Lambert, seen here on the right with fabulous parka, occupies the role of Canada's activist architect and custodian of memory. With the Canadian Centre for Architecture, founded in 1979 but opened in 1986, Lambert established an international centre that collects from all countries As the title of the CCA suggests, she conscientiously avoided placing the adjectival emphasis on Canadian architecture. So Canadian Centre of Architecture, not Centre for Canadian Architecture. Peter Rose's scheme incorporates the historic Shaughnessy House and reflects growing awareness during those years towards historic preservation. Of course, Lambert was instrumental in establishing Heritage Montreal in the mid-1970s. Elsewhere, infill projects like the Dundas-Sherburne housing in Toronto, completed in 1976 by the American-trained architects A.J. Diamond and Barton Myers, demonstrate the will to preserve existing historic fabric while inserting new life into neighborhoods. Both Diamond and Myers trained at UPenn in the late 1960s and were well aware of Edmund Bacon's Society Hill initiatives of integrating old and new fabric. This in contrast to the high modernist impact of Regent South by Peter Dickinson, completed in the 1960s. A.J. Diamond and Barton Myers with R.L. Wilkin were also the architects behind the bold yet contextually sensitive housing union building at the University of Alberta. Completed in 1973, this building was one of the 9 so-called megastructures realized in Canada that were celebrated by Rainer Banham in his 1976 publication entitled Megastructure: Urban Futures of the Recent Past. The monumental Health Service Centre at McMaster University, completed in 1967, and selected by Banham as another of Canada's most distinguished megastructure, was designed by Eberhard Zeidler with Craig Zeidler and Strong. Zeidler was trained at the reopened Bauhaus in Weimar and the Technische Hochschule in Karlsruhe and emigrated to Canada in 1951. This photo is taken by Serge Ambrose, my partner, whose photographs were integrated into the book, especially because they were very discounted rate for our services. Among the 9 buildings discussed by Banham is John Andrews Scarborough College, that you all know very well, completed in the 1960s as part of the University of Toronto's expansion to the suburbs by way of a satellite campus. Here, the Australian-born architect engages with the topographic richness and the rugged materiality of the Canadian Shield. The British-born Michael Hugh was the landscape architect with whom Andrews collaborated. Collaboration between architects and landscape architects is typical for many modernists of this decade, and we have endeavored to be as accurate as possible in our book to give all the credit they deserve when we knew it. Like Scarborough, Erickson and Massey Simon Fraser University at Burnaby, completed in 1965, at least the primary first phase, following competition, engages with the site in ways that defy the cliche of hegemonic modernism without falling into the trap of sentimental contextualism typical of certain postmodernism. And that sounds like a sloganish sentence. My co-author and I have purposely avoided using the term postmodernism in our book in favor of the expression questioning modernism, especially since Canada never experienced the wholesale rejection, at least as far as we're concerned, wholesale rejection of modernism, as did, for example, the United States. Carefully look at this sequence. As the sequence of aerial shots of the construction of Simon Fraser University demonstrates, however, befriending nature, or rather designing buildings to look like they've always belonged there, is not without its own violence to the land. While some architects engaged with the landscape during the 60s and 70s only to produce monumental buildings, others embraced environmentalism more literally as part of a return to the land movement. It is worth remembering that Greenpeace was founded in Canada in the 1970s. The off-the-grid PI Arc, seen here, opened in Prince Edward Island to much acclaim in 1976, was visited by Pierre Elliott Trudeau. The PEI Arc was a UN Habitat Canadian urban demonstration project built to explore self-sufficient housing in the wake of the 1970s energy crisis. It has since been demolished. Architects like Brian McKay Lyons in the Eastern Province of Nova Scotia initiated place-based alternative workshops, laboratories, to bring social commitment and context to the forefront of architecture education during the 1990s. The first design-build project is seen here, Ghost number 1. The students combined the frugal ethos of the Saltbox New England house with the powerful experimental associations of the wooden skeleton and the primordial hearth. From the Atlantic, we move to the Pacific, where John and Patricia Patkow, one of Canada's most impactful male-female partnerships in architecture that include the likes of Bridget Shim and Howard Sutcliffe, designed the Seabird Island School on behalf of the Aboriginal Salish people. Completed in 1992 in the Upper Fraser Valley region of British Columbia, the schools are part of a program initiated by the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, with Marie-Odile Marceau as project manager, a key figure. The aim was part of an ongoing process of reconciliation following the havoc inflicted upon the First Nations population who had been forced to assimilate in the school systems with the aim of foregoing their languages and cultures. The section that alludes to a salmon, the Seabird Island, demonstrates how the Patcow's command of section of the building is not just a cliche. When we asked John Patkow to write an endorsement of our book, he captured, and I'm saying this not just because he praised our book, what we believe to be the very essence of what is Canadian in Canadian architecture, and I quote, "Canada is an extremely large and diverse geographical area inhabited by a relatively small but overwhelmingly urban population." Rhodri Windsor Liscombe and Sabatino's excellent narration of modernism's impact on the development of Canada and Canadian architecture from 1886 to the present, virtually the entire history of Canada as a country, and this is the part that I especially admire, describes the evolution of an architecture that at its best has become intensely urban without foregoing its connection to the natural world. I think that is the point that is most important. The best of Canada's architecture is urbane without forgetting its connection to the natural world. The Métis architect Douglas Cardinal, trained in Texas, designed the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau. Quebec opened in 1986 as part of the Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau's Grand Projet legacy that included the National Gallery of Art by Moshe Safdie in Ottawa and Arthur Erickson's Chancery in Washington. It is in poignant contrast between the neo-Gothic stylistic import of the late 19th century, Parliament buildings and library, and Cardinal's explicit engagement with the layered qualities of Canada's natural landscape. In recent years, the Montreal-based landscape architect, very talented Claude Cormier, has redesigned the plaza in front of the museum to further enhance a connection with nature that was missing from its first iteration. In most recent years, the reformist impulses of the modernist project have manifested itself in what my co-author and I have called regenerative modernism. Here, sustainability is intended both as cultural and environmental. The terraced semicircular plan of the Nicola Valley Institute of Technology in British Columbia, inaugurated in 2007, is a collaboration between the Vancouver-based architect Larry Busby and First Nations architect Alfred B. Waugh. Landscape architect Cornelia Oberlander played a key role in the design of the Northwest Territories Legislative Building at Yellowknife, inaugurated in 1994. This compact urbane building designed by Pin Matthews and Matsuzaki Wright Architect addresses the extreme climate of one of Canada's most scarcely inhabited lands. Perhaps the coexistence between the massive natural and relatively limited built environment has made Canadian architects more mindful of the limited resources of the earth. This at a time when the extraction of oil from the Alberta oil sands and fracking is becoming an increasingly controversial topic among a wide swath of Canadians. This photo of Fort McMurray by Edward Bertinsky shows a pipeline as it slithers through the wilderness. It is a part of a long-term effort by this celebrated Canadian photographer to denounce the perils of extraction empires. In closing, I will use the words of former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He shared with the readers of Progressive Architecture in 1972. I believe you will find that Canadian architecture often has an unpretentious quality and reflects the diversity of its people and its climate. As our cities grow, we shall demand of our architects a sensitive interpretation of society's needs, as well as an eloquent architectural statement. The day of the individual building in isolation is over. Our concerns are in building communities that offer enrichment and increased choice to our citizens, end quote. By confronting the challenges of urban life, albeit still unable to provide sufficient affordable housing, Canada has also demonstrated the desire to be an effective custodian of its natural heritage, while eschewing the cliché of wilderness nation. In that respect, Canada might better realize the profound new design alliance sought by the pioneering modernists, the efficacious amalgamation of technology with nature in the service of an equitable human community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelangelo, for a really insightful panorama of Canadian architecture. I'm sure that there are going to be a few questions. So do we have time for some questions?
Sure.
I don't know if this is working. I'm just wondering, in the introduction you mentioned Toronto's architecture and that you did not focus on it. Can you expand on that a little bit, if what you think drives Toronto's architecture at this point, if it's not particular excellent design?
I think, so this is a bit of, let me answer the question indirectly. I think a lot of the issues that have emerged in the last 20 years have been around the fact that architects know too quickly what everyone else is doing. Let me explain. Up until the 60s, 70s, Winnipeg is a city that has an incredible amount of modernist architecture that was developed out of the University of Manitoba. They had this whole thing. Russell emigrated from America. They had this incredible development of architecture. Montreal had an amazing development of art. Toronto had a lot of interesting buildings being done, but what happened? Globalization has brought a lot of people doing the same thing, copying a lot of the stuff. And so a little bit of isolation, I think, is useful. And I say this not as a reactionary person, but I'm thinking, where did, I think, the Pat Cows, I'll say this just very openly, are the single most important architects in Canada today, whose work has been incredibly responsive to site, and it's never been sort of cookie cutter. And so they've captured, I think, whether it's under the Gardiner Expressway Viaduct or in Vancouver, or Fallingwater, sort of designing residences. They've managed to sort of be very respectful to the environment, incredibly creative and transformative in what they do. There's Brian McKay-Lyons out there, way out there in Halifax. He was doing amazing stuff. And so I think maybe Toronto's too connected to the rest of the world. Let's just put it that way. And it's interesting from a point of view of pedagogy. And I had this conversation with our former dean, Villa. It's a smart guy from Holland, who could not understand why Chicago was not New York. I mean, he lived Chicago as if he were in New York. And there's a wonderful book by a geographer, William Cronin, entitled Nature's Metropolis. And it really shows how Chicago emerged in its relationship to nature, the resources that nature provided. And so I think interesting architecture evolves not only by knowing what everyone else is doing, but to sort of engaging what are specific issues of each city. And I mean, some things like the laneway houses, and there's been a lot of interesting research done in Toronto over the years. But there is, back to, global education, where do you actually find a place where there's something that genuinely, I don't know if you can use that adjective, but belongs to a place? And so Ravel's City Hall, okay. He flew in, but he dropped in a building that was amazing and created one of the first public spaces. What's going on now? I don't know. I don't know enough of the contemporary scene. Although we did, people, and it's great. I mean, there's some great people in this city that are doing, the Richmond building project. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on. But I think maybe this is a very delicate topic.
Why is this problem, you think, unique to Toronto or Canada? It's not.
No, it's not necessarily to Canada.
You can say the same thing about Chicago today.
Absolutely.
I think the problem, in Toronto in particular, is not a lack of talent or a pedagogical problem. It's a conservatism on the part of clientele on who they'll hire, and the ability for young people to actually, for a new PACAL to emerge.
Positive. Yeah, I mean, this is not only a problem, I agree with Richard, this is not only a problem for Toronto, it's a problem in general for big cities that kind of gobble everything up, and, and whether they have, kind of the capital in the cities willing to sort of take chances or not. But I do think, I agree, it's also a problem with architecture schools, and in terms of how do you kind of create opportunities within a very global context to sort of figure out what are opportunities for being more site-specific. I think that's a challenge in general. I mean, just to give you a little silly story. I was in Delft. I was visiting professor in Delft this summer, and I was blown away by the tulip vase. This object that you put in, Vermeer painted it, but this was an object that was born out of this very specific time, place, and when you look at it that it's Dutch, and I was thinking, what are opportunities? Like, as soon as we drove over the Canadian border today, we went to Tim Hortons, right? And out of all those donuts that look alike, there was like one that was like a hockey donut, with sprinkles and a hockey player. I thought that was very interesting. It was the only thing that caught my eye, because it was like, how do you come up with something that is both belonging to everyone, but also has a slight edge of, someone being in a place? I don't know. It's a challenge. Yes.
Thank you for the pleasure to see your text. But you raised a couple of issues today and skirted over them. I mean, I was intrigued by the first image on the screen, which, rather than the grain elevators that the European modernists so admired, there was a photograph of the wood grain elevator in Nanton, Alberta, which I believe is still there. There's still a couple in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Ed, it goes back to the respectfulness of your final slide, but it addresses parts of Canada that perhaps are still missing what is arguably maybe Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver-centric text. Where, and you just did mention it in the final remarks, and Richard is quite right about the conservatism, so I applaud that. Winnipeg, which was probably the only place that embraced not necessarily modernist architecture, but which I think was a very critical proposition. You spoke of Nova Scotia, of Brian's work, but perhaps most importantly was the work is made by shipwrights, not by millwrights or carpenters. So not only there was a craft of engagement with materiality, you spoke of the West Coast engagement with the landscape, but perhaps even more important, I would argue, are the prairies, the Alberta, the Saskatchewan, not of the great object buildings, but work that spoke to the custodianship of our First Nations, of the land, and this is in spite of, and as an Alberta cowboy, I still call them the tar sands, not the oil sands. I'm not that polite. But there was something there that remains as an optimism, a respect for the land. You speak of it in some ways in the Pat Cows and in Erickson. But Trudeau the elder, had it right because he spoke of community, he spoke of nation, and not of the individual and not of the object building. And I think that might be the lesson that Canada has to offer. It might be that still missing chapter in a book which I very much enjoyed.
Thank you. I was very disappointed on this. It's this 150 years has been, I think, debacle, despite his good politics. Justin Trudeau is, they could care less about architecture. I mean, it's very interesting. Even all the, that partially inherited by Harper, but even having the competition, student competition for the 150 years logo, the investment of the government in architecture, and he said as much. He was not interested in the, repeating the Centennial Project, but that was an amazing, the Centennial Project, talk about, they went to all the cities. You got swimming pools, you got ice hockey rinks, you got the Centennial Projects were just disseminated the modern project all over the country, and were not biased toward big cities and it was, that work, I'll say this, do we really need another book on Mies van der Rohe or Le Corbusier? Probably not, but we do need a book on Arcop. We do need books on Alan Fleming. And what's very interesting and very frustrating to me, that where are the PhDs in Canada working on these things? They're not, and they should be, and there's one Harvard PhD working on a first scholarly monograph on Cormier. So, the problem is also with Canadian, partially on the onus lies on a lot of Canadian universities that are not promoting. Where's the monograph on Clifford Weens that's, waiting to come out? So, there's so much work to be done still, but there's not enough. The PhDs don't seem to want to do it, and so.
You invoked Cornelia Overlander, who continues at age 94 to do remarkable work, but also back in the days of Trudeau the elder, Peter Overlander, who writes the policy for when we used to have a Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs in Ottawa, where there was a national vision based on modernity. Peter, who you speak of schools, establishes a school of urban and regional planning based on management of water resources, something we forgot about for 40 years, and oh dear, we have a problem. And again, so many of these sessions start now, and I think with a degree of respect, of recognizing our First Nations and their place on the land. Canada is still young enough, Canada is still wild enough that as architects we can respond.
I have an anecdotal story. So my dear friend Gwendolyn Wright, who wrote the reaction book version on America, USA, she told me one time in confidence, but I think I can share it, when she was asked to do commission to the U.S., the commissioning editor, who was the same commissioning editor that asked us to do the book, said, can you put in some bit of Canada in your U.S. And so we like to say 400 pages later that, Canada's worth its own book. And then this was a great, it was a very difficult project. And as one of my very sharp-tongued friends, Witold Rybczynski, said, "Oh, you put in so much, mediocre work alongside the masterpieces." And I said, that's not the point. We tried to do a book that discussed sort of the built environment and not just the master architects, but architects that were working hard and landscape architects, the sort of collective efforts. And, again, when you do a book like this, you're obviously subject to a lot of criticism, like our friend claiming that we were colonialists. At a certain point, you have to have faith that or trust that you've done justice to the material, and then there'll be critics. What I hope, from that book as well, is that I really do hope that people will, some young or not so young, scholars will pick up and decide to sort of go and look at some of the work, and then maybe not so much. I'm not a big fan of monographs. I don't think they necessarily can. The great risk of the monograph is hagiography, of course, but if there could be sort of more work on a lot of the figures that we all know maybe, but the archives are all there, but there's still a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done. And the names that were hidden, like for example, we were just putting for our Canadian Modern series, Geoffrey Lindsay, who was a kind of a Bucky Fuller student, was involved with all the geodesic domes. I mean, he was all there. He worked with Ericsson for all the space frame stuff, and he was just. Now we're just putting out a book on. So I think as scholarship develops, we have a lot more opportunities to sort of see the nuances and But again, I take your point. I think I don't think there's a Canadian language. There's an attitude. I think to type of buildings, and I think you can find those scattered across the nation. And we tried to look at all. This is I promised myself after I stopped being poor graduate student that I would never write about any building that I had not seen. And I still hold very true to that. I don't think you should write about buildings that you haven't seen. So we tried to see all the buildings, and we also tried to see them, in the usage that 25 years later or 50 years later, and to sort of be careful about that. Although that kind of detail in a 400-page book and hundreds of buildings, you can't really bring that in. You just have to. And I'm sure I made a lot of people angry. The worst thing is writing about living architects. Awful. I have to say, I prefer writing about dead architects because they can't complain that you've left them out. And so we got our series of complaints, but so be it.
So we have time for just a couple more questions. Did we have some other questions? The microphone is coming.
And I enjoyed very much your talk, and sorry, maybe my question comes from outside architecture, but more sort of an anthropological look into it. And it's really interesting because the kind of presence-absence of your talk is really wilderness. So how do you really define wilderness and the wild? Because it's really interesting if you really do that work, start in Canada, in the Americas. I think the Americans teach us that there is like the change from the kind of the being taken by the wild into the wild as terror, because there is a whole history of, especially in South America, of kind of wilderness connected to extractive industry and connected to the terror, that sort of wild that eats you back. So it's really interesting. I don't know if there is a kind of conversation to go on, but how maybe the ruination of the modern architecture tells us of this kind of terror also that is intrinsic in the wild, or maybe this is not at all something that architecture has been focusing on, and maybe this is a very unfair question. I was really interested. What is your conceptualization of the wild and the wilderness?
Yeah, I think there's been many books written on sort of the wilderness, but not. I personally think that's why I said the title is Beyond Wilderness. I think that's a bit of a cliche. I think for Canada, everyone's walking around with their fur coats and like their Hudson Bay blanket wrapped around them. I don't really believe that very much. I think that actually Canadian architects have been very urbane, and in fact, think of the National Arts Centre, Arcop, Fred Liebenshold. I mean, in Ottawa along the Rideau. Where did they place that building? They placed it, right in the epicenter, 5 minutes from Parliament Building. So I don't think. Well, I don't think there's been any theorization of wilderness by Canadian architects. I do think they, materiality. If you think of Bridget Shim and Howard Sutcliffe, I mean, they wouldn't. They bring in materials. Wood is a kind of constant in much of Canadian architecture, but I don't think they're considering that in terms of wilderness. They're considering that in terms of sort of relationship to how things are built and what are kind of the material context of the country. So I don't know. Maybe that's a disappointing response, but I think Canadian architects are much more urbane than the Inuit living in their igloo, that kind of stuff.
We have a question up here in the front row. Everything has to be mediated.
Oh, okay. So I just wanted to go back to the bulbs, the tulip bulbs for a second that you mentioned in passing. I would actually venture that those bulbs are not Dutch per se, because historians have demonstrated that they're actually the...
Which bulbs? What?
The tulip bulbs that you were talking
the vase,
yeah. Right, because, I mean, the Dutch, what we consider Dutch, stereotypical Dutch item is actually the result of a gigantic global
empire
business of horticulture across the colonies, right? So by that logic, there is no such thing as wilderness. Wilderness, actually, people have theorized wilderness. I mean, Victoria De Palma's last book is a good theorization of this. Wilderness is what something is called before it's theorized, more colonized before anything else. So by that logic, what is wilderness? To go back to the question that was posed from the audience, what is the valency of the Canadian wilderness, and can you understand that nature as so narrowly Canadian when we know that it was part of a network of transatlantic trade starting in the 16th, 17th centuries, and there is nothing Canadian about it from that.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. Did I miss? I said that in the writings, no Canadians theorize that I read. Maybe I'm totally, but Canadian architects, everything that I read, no one theorized wilderness, in the architectural press. The thing about what's beautiful about, take back to the Dutch example, the Delft blue, right? The famous Delft blue. What was that? Well, it's a combination of Portuguese and the Chinese that then ends up being claimed by the Dutch as, Delft blue. That kind of interactions are going on constantly, and that's if I wasn't clear, I mean, that's what I'm saying, that the Canadian project has always been about that, about forces that have been coming in, out, and that's why the issue of nature with, Rockies, yes, you have different building codes in, Seattle versus Vancouver, but there's a lot of shared elements like climate and materiality that really sort of go beyond the sort of the tight framework of nation, so I'm saying this is much more of a porous thing, and in fact, a little bit uncomfortable. It's in a nation by nation kind of series of books, so it's already straitjacketed there. But I think what we tried to say is no. It's kind of a moving target, just like what the modern is too. Like Canadianness was something very different in the 20s and 30s than it was in the 60s with the centennial celebrations.
We have time for maybe one more quick question right there.
Speaking of the wilderness, did you consider including the bitumen extraction plants carved out of the boreal forests, where you have fly-in communities of several thousand workers? They're just extraordinary complexes. And it seems to be they are our modern grain elevators.
No, sorry, that's for edition number 2.
That was a quick answer, so we have some time for one more question. If somebody has a...
Thank you for your presentation. I want to go back to this, the relationship between Canadian architecture and specificity and universality, more or less. Don't you think that the lack of universality, or let's say the aim of saying something beyond the place, local places, and being Canadian is something that is missing in contemporary Canadian architecture? Because, if we think about, okay, I'll let you answer maybe. The fact that you're saying Canadian architecture is good because it's all based on a good understanding of a place. But first of all, because today it's hard to say that something is specific just because it belongs to a specific place, since that I visited the museum by Pat Cow in Vancouver, and I don't think it's so far from international architectural trends. So
yeah, I'm not advocating for kind of parochial sort of. Any good architecture resonates both universally and locally. I think finding that kind of balance is not easy, right? And some architects have found it, others have not. Some find it in certain buildings, and others throughout their career, and others don't. Like, for example, Brian McKay-Lyons does beautiful houses and horrible urban buildings. I'm sorry, I can't record that. His urban buildings don't have the same kind of resonance, at least in my humble opinion, that his single-family homes do. And so, why is that? I think every architect, depending on what their talents are, they figure out what they do best. And so, and it's not a formula. It's not like putting 2 parts international, universal, and 1 part local will get you there. It's more of and that's it's more an ability to kind of capture certain aspects. Like, look at Aldo Rossi. Aldo Rossi, for many regards, was incredibly Italian, but then he was able to build all over the world. And Renzo Piano. But what does that mean? In terms of Piano's own background and his relationship to.
Yeah, but don't you think that this dialogue between local and universal is missing, or it's something that maybe Canadian architecture should be aimed for?
Not just Canadian. There's plenty. Think of Zumthor, or think of. There's plenty of great architects that Gehry. Let me say something that's going to make me incredibly unpopular. I find it absolutely ridiculous that Canadians claim Gehry as a Canadian architect. Gehry would be nowhere, would he? You become, through your education, yes, he grew up in Kensington, whatever, but he became Gehry because he went to Los Angeles, right? And your educational background is hugely important. It's not about a passport, it's about where you learn about architecture and where you sort of experiment. And, I agree in this case, Gary would have never done what he did in Toronto. Can you imagine? I mean, Toronto was a very conservative place. If you think of, it was only with a lot of, the emigres that 50s, 60s, 70s that it became, it was the kind of Anglo bastion of, Anglo-Scottish bastion was like put aside. Think of Nathan Phillips Square, the first Jewish mayor. Like this place was not Montreal. Montreal was way more, Anyway, so I think this is not about kind of. I think the problem is a lot of people face this problem. A lot of contemporary architects, and certainly students of architecture, will face this even more. Like, they're designing buildings for places that they've never visited, and they just sit in front of their computers and generate plans. And maybe the principals will spend the money to kind of fly to the cities, and then the majority of them never see where they're building for. And they might look at Google Earth, if they're lucky, but that's a big problem, I think. That's potentially a very big problem. So we need to get scholarships that get students traveling as much as possible, and seriously, because I mean, thankfully, we live in a jet age, where flying is cheap, relatively cheap. But that has to be something that people really believe is worthwhile doing, spending the money to actually make the visit. It's a little bit like Skyping. I've always found that Skyping is great when you already know the people, but when you don't know them, just to Skype, there's a crazy disconnect. But maybe I'm a kind of romantic, traditionalist, but...
Well, on that note, of romance and tradition, thank you very much.
Thank you.